behalf of the board and behalf of the Institute, want to welcome you to the Shark Tank, or oh, I'm sorry, what do we call it officially, Mark? To the think tank, the think tank here, the Bechtel Conference Center. How many folks are here for the first time? Conference Center. Okay, well, welcome. And it's a vision of Mark Baldassare's to create a public space for folks to think about and talk about and hopefully act on issues that affect California. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank especially the Secretary of State Debra Bowen for being here with us just a few days after really a historic election that we're going to talk about. I do want to thank those who make possible the work of PPIC and the center here, and specifically the speaker series of which this is a part. I want to thank S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, Pacific Life Foundation, Southern California Edison, the Stewart Foundation, Union Bank, and our knowledge partner, McKinsey & Company. So all these entities have helped make possible the series and, again, the work of PPIC. Also, PPIC's donor circle contributes to the series as well. And I think, if you're interested, you could probably become a part of the PPIC donor circle. So don't think it's so exclusive that you can't be a part of it. Before we get going, I want to give you a couple housekeeping issues. Number one is evaluation forms. There are evaluation forms. I know there are because it's in my script, but I think they're actually in your program. So in your program, they're confidential. Mark Baldassare is a very good surveyor, and all of his surveys are confidential. If you don't mind, please, the only cost for attending the event today would be to please fill out the evaluation to help us hopefully provide better forums, better information for you and others as we move forward. And then the second housekeeping issue is it's a rule, not just a guideline, but an actual rule. Please silence your cell phones during the conversation. I think tweeting is okay, but if you just silence your phones, that would be much appreciated. We have two parts of the program today. First part is with Eric McGhee, who will discuss the two vital reforms that have taken place to affect last week's election and California politics and policy moving forward, the top two primary and the redistricting reforms. Also, the second part of the conversation will be the actual conversation with Secretary Bowen and PPIC President and CEO Mark Baldassare, talking about how to engage more Californians in the state's elections and policymaking, which is what PPIC is all about. So with that, I'm proud to introduce Eric McGhee. Eric is a policy fellow at the PPIC. I want to be a fellow one day. I love that title. He's a fellow here at PPIC, and his work focuses on elections, legislative behavior. Just think about that for a minute. Legislative behavior and political participation. So without further ado, please welcome Eric McGhee.
Thanks, Ruben. So California has been at it again. We're experimenting with a new policy and running the risk that the rest of the country might copy us. That gives, of course, heartburn to people like me who have to try and understand what's going on. This time, it's an independent redistricting commission and an open top two primary. The numbers are still pretty fresh right now. It's kind of like looking at a photo in a dark room and sort of gradually comes into focus. But I think we can say some things about where we are and a few things about where we might be going next. So did the reforms produce the results that people wanted? Well, I think we can break that into three parts: successes, possible failures, and too early to say. In terms of successes, competition, I think, is the big success here. People wanted these reforms to produce more competition, and I think they largely delivered. So open seats are up this year, the incidence of open seats. Highest in 20 years in the House, and high for our average in the legislature. There's more challenges within the same party to sitting incumbents. There's just more same-party competition in general. And there are more competitive seats as a result of the redistricting. There's not a lot more competitive seats, but there are a notable number compared with what we had before. I also think just in terms of the redistricting commission, it was successful in the sense that it really helped to dial down the intense redistricting fight that we have every 10 years. I know maybe it didn't seem like it dialed it down for those of you who are watching, but compared to the norm for California, I think it was remarkably smooth. The commission produced plans that were better on most of the dimensions that voters said they cared about, especially compactness, but also splitting city and county lines into multiple districts and minority representation. And they did it without obviously or unfairly advantaging one party, even though I think the Democrats probably will do a little better under these new plans. And most important, the courts really gave an emphatic seal of approval to the commission's work. So in terms of the kinds of fights we typically have over redistricting, this was pretty good. What might be some of the failures, at least sort of initial failures? Well, if we wanted to try and sort of keep parties or incumbents out of the process, it was only a partial success, I would say. The redistricting did manage to put a pretty tight wall around the commission. It was not perfect. It was somewhat porous, but there was a wall between the commission and the political establishment. The easiest way to see that is that the average incumbent this year was running in a seat that was 45% new territory for them. And there were a number of incumbents who were matched up against each other, at least initially. Most of them managed to avoid those contests. However, all incumbents advanced to the fall. All but 4 came in first place. And 2 of those 4 who didn't were named Laura Richardson and Howard Berman. And they were running against other incumbents, so it was a little hard to see how they could advance without somebody being in second place. There were also 113 candidates who were not incumbents but were endorsed by one of the major parties. And 101 of those 113 advanced to the fall. Now, there were also some people who advanced to the fall who were not endorsed by the parties and were not incumbents. But I'd say that's a pretty good track record all the same. Voter engagement. A lot of people wanted these reforms to get more voters to the polls, and I think they just have not done that yet. Turnout was on the low side. Whether it was a record low or not depends on what your reference point is, but it was definitely low. And then I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention Congressional District 31, where the top 2 primary produced 2 Republicans running against each other in the fall in a district that actually has more Democratic registrants than Republican registrants. Now, this was something that opponents of reform had said might happen. It's, I think, nonetheless a little surprising that it already happened, just the first time out the gate. And it does point to one of the sort of risks of a wide open system of this kind. Nonetheless, I think there may be some tweaks we could do to the top 2 reform that might address this kind of issue without actually just abandoning the reform entirely. For instance, the top 2 actually, the law that implemented it actually bans write-in candidates from the fall ballot. It would be possible to relax that and provide a sort of safety valve for candidates during the fall. There's a variety of other things that might be changed without actually undoing the structure of the top 2 itself. And then sort of the final category, we had successes, failures. The final category is, it's too early to say. And I think in this category falls the thing that people most wanted to see from this reform, which was electing more moderates, more sort of problem solvers to the legislature and to Congress. And I think it just is too early to say whether that has happened yet. In terms of the candidates that the media identified as moderates beforehand, it's been sort of a mixed bag. Some of them are advancing, some of them are not. But we don't really know whether those candidates are going to be moderate when they serve in office. We don't know whether the people who kind of act like partisans now might not prove to be more moderate once they serve. So more to come on that. And looking forward, the ballot for the fall will is going to be pretty exciting. So there's a lot of stuff on the ballot, a lot of initiatives, obviously a presidential contest, which will get just a little bit of attention. And the choices for the legislature will matter, I think, a little bit more this time, especially for the Assembly, because the term limits law passed a week ago, and now Assembly members, as a practical matter, can serve longer than they have been. I think history also tells us that the fall electorate will probably be a little bit more Democratic than the one that we just had, so that may put some races that, that seem kind of out of the competitive range into the competitive range. And I think as we move toward the fall, redistricting is going to come a little bit more into focus because the cross-party races are going to come more into focus. And questions of two-thirds control for Democrats in the legislature are going to be a big issue. So lots of exciting stuff going on. And I think just beyond that, this is really just the first experiment with these new reforms. It's not likely they're going to be done anytime soon, I would say. So we've got lots of time to experience them and see how they all play out. And it'll be fascinating to see whether sort of the status quo continues or whether we're kind of at the beginning of a new political order. So at this time, I would like to invite Secretary of State Debra Bowen and PPIC President Mark Baldassare to the stage. We all look forward to your conversation today. Thank you, guys.
Eric, thanks very much. Eric's like a kid in a candy store right now, you know, with all these reforms going on and everything that we're seeing. Secretary of State, thank you so much for being here today, week after the election. You know, in many states you run the risk when you would have your Secretary of State a week after the election, like there might be some problem or something with the election, but this Secretary of State, I know. And when we planned this election, I thought, this election conversation, I thought, you know, everything's going to be okay. She's going to be able to be here. The votes will be counted and so forth. A little bit about Secretary of State's background. Amazing career thus far in public service. 6 years in the Assembly, 8 years in the Senate. Elected twice to Secretary of State. You know, we're very fortunate to have this type of leadership. So starting off from where we left off with Eric, I'd like to ask you what it is that we learned in this first ever experiment from your perspective as the person who is in charge of the election. What did we learn about the top two and the redistricting from this round?
I mean, it's a little bit like looking back at your freshman year of college and asking whether it was the beer or the pizza that caused you to gain 15 pounds. And probably wasn't, it was probably both and some other things as well. So, you know, we always have a lot going on. We've also begun the process of moving initiatives to the November election, and so we had a relatively smaller voter information guide this June than any other June voter information guide that I've produced. And I think it's a mixed bag because when I look at, first of all, I think it's useful to keep in mind that the choice to go to a top two primary was one that was made by 50, not very many % of the voters. And I'm always reluctant to say what legislative intent was, even when there were only 120 actors. When there are millions of actors, who knows what they really thought they wanted. And when I look at competition, I was doing a quick run, and there are 25 assembly races out of 80 that have two candidates running. So we have the same two people running in June who will run again in November, and I think we have 7 or 8 just in the Assembly who are unopposed, which is a relatively large number of unopposed candidates. We did have some what I consider to be bizarre results from knowing people, but that always happens in every primary, and it always happens in special elections. If it didn't, I'd be in Congress right now. And thank God I'm not, because there would have been not have been a Bowen versus Waxman race, because I'm smarter than that. And that was a result of redistricting that happened right after the primary in that special election. So thank God I still have my job as Secretary of State. But we still have, I think, a lot of learning to do. And my question is whether or not we're going to see the same kinds of results 5 years out, 10 years out, and 20 years out that we do now, or whether people will figure out how to take the best advantage of these changes, and that we'll get something very different at the beginning than at the end. I think that happened with the term limits initiative. It was very different in the first 2 terms of elections, where a whole lot of new people came in than it is now. The results are very different.
So, were there any surprises that you heard from the field? Anything with voter confusion or precinct workers that were confused, or any reports that gave us a sense that, you know, this was a difficult process for people, or
No,
it seemed to go pretty smoothly?
It's very easy. Here's the list of candidates. You can vote for one. That's not hard. We've been doing that pretty much all of our lives. And we got almost no questions about the top 2 primary on our hotline. The only place where I saw any confusion was over the close contest section on my website. And that is, it's not my judgment about what races are close. It's driven solely by numbers, and it's driven by looking at the difference between the 2nd and 3rd place candidates. Because we're not so interested in whether the 1st place candidate can squish the others as we are in seeing who the 2 people are who are going on to November. And I did get some questions about why I thought that these 2 particular candidates were in a close race, as well as somebody who tweeted me that I should have included the Alameda County Board of Supervisors on the list, which turned out to be an inside joke, since apparently they're deadlocked 2-2 on appointing a replacement for a vacant seat. And I didn't get the inside joke. Yes, that's Nadia Lockyer's seat. Yes. So that's the only place where I saw any confusion.
So I'm on the website, now that you mention it, I don't know, once an hour or something like that, you know, this time of year. I've seen your photo many times on the website. And the thing that surprised me was the turnout, you know, and still the number of votes that need to be counted given the size of the turnout. I wonder if you could speak to the issue of how you viewed the turnout this time, and what about all those votes that we're still counting?
Well, the turnout was abysmal, and it's probably the single most disappointing thing to me about.
What do we expect the turnout will be?
I don't
Maybe a third,
make projections
like
because I just don't know how on earth you make them. But this is a very low turnout for a presidential election. This actually looks more like the turnout in the last presidential election in the June primary. You know, that was the year where we split the presidential, and in the June primary then we had a very low turnout, and we're in about that ballpark. We have about 500,000 ballots left to be processed in round numbers. That's not a surprise to me. We had double that at the beginning. We're getting many more voters dropping their ballot off at the polling place, at a polling place in their county on Election Day.
Saving money on the stamps.
Well, I think it's ensuring that it gets there.
Making sure it gets there.
And it's also that, you know, many of us just can't manage to sit down with all of that fine mail we've been receiving until the very last moment. And I think also in a primary, there were some people who got burned 4 years ago, voted early by mail, and then had their candidate effectively drop out of the primary. And I remember getting calls asking if, you know, can I do it over? And, there and get my ballot out. And there were also a couple of instances where people voted early and candidates said, in a couple of races, said or did some things that many people found to be unacceptable, and yet they had already voted. So I think we're going to continue to see that, particularly as more and more people are nominally voting by mail, even if that includes dropping the ballot off yourself. That's counted as mailing it in.
So California has, you know, a very large and diverse population. You know, we've done work, and you know, you and I have talked about the work that we've done on whether our voter population is representative of the adult population, and it's not. So you've got the issue of voter registration as well as participation. What is your office trying to do about improving the numbers for both voter registration and how many people actually turn out to vote?
Well, the registration piece of it, I think, is easier to deal with, and we are on track to roll out around Labor Day online voter registration for anybody who has a California driver's license or ID card. We're working with the counties and the DMV. We're going to be using the signatures that the DMV has, and I think it's going to be the single biggest change in voter registration. It should improve accuracy. It should dramatically decrease the amount that counties spend on the registration process, since right now somebody physically types all of the information that's on the form into a computer.
Wow.
Except in those, we have a few counties who can take a barcode and pull the information out. So that's going to be a huge change. With the actual voting, my focus has been on the high school mock election. And we had several 100,000 students participate in the high school mock election. I'd like to get every single high school in the state participating. We know that if we can get young people voting for the first time when they're 18, that they are much more likely to continue to be regular voters. So it's really important to develop that habit. And we do that, and we have a program called Democracy at Work where we partner with businesses and nonprofits who send out reminder messages. But you know, ultimately, if somebody doesn't find it in their interest to vote, we don't make them. So. And why is a continuing source of agony for somebody who is just a bully on democracy.
Have you had any programs during the time that you've been in office that you felt were more effective than others?
You know, it's really hard to know. I mean, it's the pizza and beer problem again. Yeah. I have no doubt that the greatest single turnout factor in the last presidential election was this tall, skinny guy from Illinois who motivated a lot of people to vote. And you know, we registered people in their 50s who had never registered before, who wanted to take part in what they perceived as a historic election.
Yeah, the recall sort of did that earlier in the decade in a different way. So you mentioned that you're moving to online, and that's exciting for this next election. What other types of activities that you've been involved in around the accuracy of voting or bringing in new technology that we might know about? Because, you know, accuracy's been, well, it's been a big deal for a decade, and the use of technology constantly, you know, innovating in so many different areas. How is it changing the work we do in elections?
California has actually spawned an entirely new academic subject. It's called election auditing. It didn't exist until about 5 years ago. Which I find truly shocking, the idea that we could have had, you know, over 200 years in democracy and nobody said, let's develop a method of auditing elections that gives us as close to 100% certainty as we can get that we got the result that accurately reflects the vote. Now, it's possible that in some places election officials didn't wish to know. And I did grow up outside Chicago, so I claim to have a little experience with at least the legend, if not the truth. But we're looking at risk-limiting audits. We're looking at developing a methodology that tells us how many ballots or precincts we need to audit. And we went from the 1% of precincts, counting every race in 1%, to now looking at really needing to have a different number of ballots looked at depending on how many voters there are in a contest. A mayoral election that's got a 3-vote margin is going to require a different look at ballots than Prop 29, which has a margin of somewhere around 26,000 votes at this point. And we've actually developed a secondary ballot scanning capability so that all of a county's ballots can be scanned a second time, and that every ballot can be made accessible to anybody who needs a life. No, I'm kidding. Anybody who wants to spend their time poring over ballots. And we also have one new law that I want to highlight. We call it the Doodle Bill. It used to be California law that if you doodled on your ballot, it couldn't be counted. Even if you drew a daisy on the side. And the idea was that that was a potential breach of privacy, that it could signal to somebody how that ballot belonged to a particular person. And so now, unless the doodle is a signature or a social security number, those ballots will be counted. So a doodle no longer disqualifies the vote from being counted. We're trying to take voting and look at it as from an engineering standpoint, and look at the points of failure and constantly look for systemic improvements, and look for ways that if a mistake is made in one place, that we can limit that mistake to that one place, and everyone else can learn from it instead of having to do it in order to learn from it.
Interesting. So one of the most controversial aspects of voting in California involves the initiative process, right? So we're very different. Well, we're with other states that have it, but we use it a lot, and
Hiram Johnson would roll in his grave, I'm sure.
And your office is right in the middle, always, of everything that has to do with initiatives and getting them on the ballot and qualifying them. And that's the other thing. I'm on your website all the time looking for what's qualified, who's out there, what's failed. Tell me about the initiative process from your perspective. What can we do to fix it? Because people say they want it, but they also say it's not working the way it should.
Well, I think, and I agree, and I've took an interest in the initiative process for the first time in 1995 with a bill that I still think we should pass. Actually, there are a couple of things we could do right off the bat. One is to require the initiative petition to list the top 5 donors who are paying the expenses of qualifying that initiative, so that we don't have surprises about who was behind. I think California voters are pretty savvy, and when they know who's paying for something, that's one of the most important pieces of information. And I also think it's very important to let people know in big type, not you can ask, but is the person who wants your signature paid or a volunteer? And it goes to the likelihood that they will be able to accurately describe and have the motivation to accurately describe the content of the petition. And one of the biggest problems we have is enforcing the law that says that it's illegal to misdescribe the contents of a petition. That is, even with cell phone cameras, it's still often a he said, she said.
Well, wasn't there a bill like that?
We need to make a better case with the governor for why we need that. But I would go further. I would like to see us divide the initiative process into a citizen initiative, and I'm not going to wouldn't call it the big money initiative, but that's really what it is. I'd give a citizen initiative a much longer time to qualify if citizens agreed not to spend any money other than for printing and legal costs. No paid circulators. And let's see whether we get something different out of that process. And then I would shorten up the period for campaigns that are going to involve paid circulators. And I think people will quickly adapt, and I'm sure it'll become part of the strategy discussion, whether you get a built-in credibility boost if you go the route of no paid circulators, but it means something in terms of who's signed it and the effort that's required if you're not paying people. I think most Californians don't know that at crunch time, circulators can get as much as $8 or $10 a signature.
Wow.
There's an industry that's, it's like carnies.
Yeah.
They follow the initiative process around the country.
Well, somehow money has found its way into the conversation about politics and elections.
Shocking.
How could that be? So let's talk about campaign finance issues a little bit. Your office also very involved in tracking money, and you've been involved as a legislator in terms of trying to figure out, how to make this process more transparent, understandable for the public. What do you think? But then again, there's a Supreme Court and rulings, and so forth.
And I think, one of the worst cases probably will go down, Citizens United, I think, will go down in history as one of the worst cases since Dred Scott.
What can California do around campaign finance that we're not currently doing?
Well, there's the actual, not a lot with the independent expenditures now, and I think it's not a surprise that the more you ratchet down the direct contributions to a candidate, the money is going to go someplace when there's a lot at stake, and it goes to the independent expenditure campaigns, which are a real mixed blessing for a candidate because many times they annoy your base rather than being helpful. You don't have any, but there are some really obvious things that I don't think California could do. But the idea that you have somebody who was staff or a campaign official who's now running a, quote, independent expenditure, I think just belies common sense. And we really ought to have a better federal definition of what it means for an expenditure to be independent. In the long run, I think we need a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United.
A state and the state
Federal.
Oh, federal. Federal. Okay. So another thing that when I read your website about voter registration, almost every time you produce new numbers on voter registration, we're finding out that there are more independent voters than there were the last time, and that is the biggest group of voters growing. And you're a registered Democrat. Many people are still registered with parties, but most people who are newly registering are registering as independents. As somebody who has watched the numbers just increase dramatically during your time in office, they've doubled from 10 to 20%. What's going on? What do you think is going on with people registering as no party preference? Well,
there are many folks who spend all of their waking hours on this question, but there are a couple things that I think are worth noting. One is that there's also a trend for people to report, for example, to census takers that they are spiritual but don't belong to a particular denomination. And I can't help but wonder if the same kind of mindset is at work.
So they're all spiritual people.
Basically you have people saying, I buy into the values of a certain thing, but I reject the institutional, I guess many people view it as baggage that goes with it. And I think many of the decline to state voters have very strong views. There are those there are always a handful of voters who can't decide, and I don't understand them at all, so I won't try to explain them. They think that Al Gore and George Bush are pretty much the same as a candidate, and what can I say? But they just don't want the affiliation. Now, there was a benefit to that even before the top two primary, in that you could choose to participate depending on the party's rules. You might choose to participate in different party primaries that way.
Where do you think this will end up, this trend will end up, you know, if we 10 years from now, where do you see it going?
I don't think it's slowing down. I mean, we really are seeing it with our under 30 voters, although we don't have no partisan voters. There certainly are very active Democratic clubs and Republican clubs on the campuses today, so I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But I do think that there's just this general sense, you know, it goes along with our kind of rugged individualism and, you know, who needs a political party, and I vote for the person, not the party. And you hear that from people who probably have always voted for candidates of the same party, but the idea that they analyze, and I'm sure they do, is important.
We're thinking about the November election. We're going to be asking voters to make some pretty big decisions, right? Taxes, death penalty, 3 strikes, paycheck protection. What do you think should be done in terms of educating voters about the decisions that they're making, other than we're all going to be watching a lot of 30-second commercials on TV?
You know, the voter information guide and the idea that we present an argument in support and then an argument against and then a rebuttal to that, that's actually fairly unique and is something that doesn't occur really at all east of the Mississippi. And that, I think, and the fiscal analysis in the voter information guide are very important tools for voters. But many of the other tools don't come out of the Secretary of State's office. I think the Sunlight Foundation has done some great work in giving people a way to look to see in one place where are organizations whose view I'm interested in, you know, where do they come down on a particular candidate. You've got one place you can go to find out where's the National Rifle Association, where's the League of Conservation Voters, where's the California Teachers Association. You don't have to go to all those websites. You can just go to the Sunlight Foundation. It's all there.
And do you think people have enough information to make good decisions?
You know, I know that many people, and I was always this way when I wasn't in the legislature, always felt like I didn't have enough information to make a good decision. But we nonetheless made the best decision that we could make. And I think that it is critical to keep the format of the voter information guide. I would very much like to experiment with doing some write your own ballot arguments, some things that we can do online. I don't know if it'll work. You know, the LA Times tried some online stuff like that and found that it was just an exercise in people erasing or countering the comments that somebody had just posted, and it was who could get on the website the fastest. So I don't know how you...
Maybe videos. We're learning that a lot of people would rather watch a video than read a report.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, we may look at, you know, make a video argument, and some of the things that came out of the last campaign, you know, give a video pitch and then let people watch the videos and vote for the 5 they find the most persuasive. We may see just entirely new tools.
Ways of learning. When you think about the November election, I'm going to go out on a limb and say the turnout's going to be a lot higher than it was in June, right? Probably double the number, right, of people.
We have a lot of issues
the ballot's going to be a lot longer because we only had the 2 initiatives that had cleared. There'll be a lot more hefty matters, a lot more people voting. As the Secretary of State, is there anything that keeps you up at night about this election that's coming up in November?
No.
No?
No.
Good.
You know,
then you'll sleep well between now and the election.
We try very hard to anticipate things that could go wrong and to proofread everything. You know, we still have always, there's a place, there's always a county in California that has a ballot misprint, and it always gets remedied. There's always something.
No hanging
you have
chads,
25,000 polling places, somebody is going to oversleep.
Yeah, okay.
And, but, you know, those are within the margin
Yeah.
of tolerance. If if 3 polling places open 10 minutes late, I can live with that. So, you know, we work very hard to, with a checklist that's, I mean, we have an E-minus, you know, countdown checklist, and a very well-developed sense, and the counties do as well. So we pray for boring election days and wide margins.
Right, and good weather, right?
And good weather.
Yeah.
But I think we're likely to have a successful election again. I do think we're going to have a much larger turnout. I mean, there are some very emotional issues in the initiative process that I think are going to make for a fascinating election, and I think it's going to be a great teaching election for the high school mock election. I mean, just imagine teaching the death penalty as a way to look at policy.
Terrific. Yeah, it's great. Well, let's get some questions going here.
When a minor party ran, and there were at least 2 major party people running, there's not a single case where the minor party ever advanced. And I feel that's a loss to our society, and I wonder if you would each comment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I won't comment, but
I think it's a
Secretary
loss too, but you know, it's a choice that the legislature decided to put before the voters, and then a majority of voters chose to do that. But I do think it's a loss. I think it's a loss of a voice that we are no longer going to hear after June. And
yeah, that is. I mean, I would agree. I would, even though I said I wouldn't say anything about it, I would agree with everything about that. Yes.
Secretary Bowen, you mentioned. Oh, thank you, Secretary Bowen. Michelle Romero with the Green Lining Institute. You mentioned earlier that you supported putting the top 5 donor information on the ballot petitions. And I think that a lot of voters we've seen in polling suggest that voters want this kind of information. I know you have supported legislation in the past as well to put top donors in the ballot guide. With the governor vetoing that legislation that would have required top donor information in the voter information guides, have you considered whether you in your position would voluntarily offer that information in the voter guides for November?
That's a good question. It's something I think, you know, we can look at it, but you know, the information is available in November, and we actually do put in the voter guide information about the top donors. It is at the point, it's at the petition, the signature gathering time that I really think voters need to have that information. But then I wish voters would stop and I wish that they would say no to the argument it's just to put it on the ballot. If you don't have a good sense of liking this, don't sign it, because you're just going to complain in November that there's too much stuff on the ballot.
True, true.
But, you know, people can do what they wish. That's the nature
Question
of our...
on this side of the room. Yes.
As one of those annoying people who gets an absentee ballot and takes it to my polling place on election day.
We didn't say you were annoying.
No.
Is there any reason why we can't just open it up there and put it in the machine? If it's my polling place?
Yeah, I actually think that from the standpoint of voter process, that poll worker process, that we would have to have a process for verifying that, because once that ballot goes into the box, there's no way to take it back out. The reason that we have provisional ballots is because we don't want to disenfranchise someone, but we also don't want someone to vote twice. So I think it's simpler to just say we're going to process these. You know, we do compare the signature on vote by mail ballots with the signature on the record. So, and I think many people don't know that. Every single ballot, vote by mail ballot, the signature is compared with the signature on the voter card, and it is the reason historically that we've needed a hard signature. With one of the issues that we're going to be grappling with on online voter registration is what happens if someone's signature has changed since they signed the DMV, their driver's license. You know, how are we going to allow a voter to change that? How are we going to notify voters? So, you know, I think it's a good thing, but we're going to have technical issues. But I think it's better to just, you know, let that process be that process for ballots that are delivered, and then people who sign in and get that ballot. I'd have to think about it, but the risk of having somebody vote twice is an unacceptable risk to me.
Mm-hmm. My name is David Carey. One of the things the top two has highlighted is that there are a lot of people who vote who don't vote for an eventual winner. In each of the three legislative House races that we have, the California Assembly, the Senate, and the Federal House of Representatives, about 40 to 50% of the voters who voted in June will end up voting for somebody that won't win in November. They won't get the representation that they asked for. If that's the way we're treating voters, why are we surprised that a lot of them eventually decide it's not worth it? Shouldn't we be treating voters better?
Well, that's an interesting point, but I think, you know, people are accustomed to the idea. I mean, we do have generally a winner-take-all system, although it's certainly possible to have multi-representative districts where you have a district that has, say, 3 representatives. You're more likely to get representation that way, but it does increase the cost of campaigning because people are talking to more. There's nothing you can do that doesn't have a pro and a con when it comes to elections. Everything has two sides. But you know, what we've done in a democracy is, as long as we believe the process was fair and we know we'll get an opportunity to have our point of view carry the day in the next election cycle, we're willing to transfer power peacefully. It breaks down if people don't think the process was fair, and that's part of the reason that I've spent so much time on ensuring that the process is fair and that it's transparent so that anybody can verify that. You know, instant runoff voting is another answer, potential answer to that. But there have been some interesting experiments with that. And I think the jury's out, but I certainly would support further experimentation. The first place I would go with that is in special elections, where we often see a turnout that can be as low as single digits in a runoff in a special election. And I'm not interested in wasting money. I mean, I think those 25 assembly races where we have the same 2 people running in June and November, we should eliminate one of those 2 elections, and I would eliminate the June one. It's really silly to have the same 2 people run against each other twice if they're the only 2 people who qualified for the ballot. That's silly.
That's a good point. You've been anxious to talk for a while. I know you've had your hand on your head, so what's on your mind?
Can you talk about the voter registration system and the new VoteCal database? So one of the things that we have in the present system is every time you move, and most people move 12 or 15 times in their lifetime, young people move, you know, very often. Wow. Could be, you have to re-register. You don't have to reapply for a driver's license. You don't have to reapply for your credit cards. Why do you have to reapply to be registered? And can't we just do something like they do with credit cards or driver's licenses so that the registration automatically stays valid?
You know, I think we're moving more in that direction. You know, the reason that we've asked people to re-register when they've moved from one county to another is because we need that physical signature in the county to both for initiative petition verification and because we actually compare the signature on vote-by-mail ballots. But once we go to the online, the DMV signature, there will no longer be a requirement that people re-register when they move. Now, you are not required to be registered to vote at the same place where your car is registered and where your driver's license is, so we don't want to automatically move people. And in fact, Michigan some years ago started moving people off their voter registration rolls if they changed their driver's license out of Michigan, and the Secretary of State was sued and lost. Just because somebody's changed their address to Indiana doesn't mean that that's now their political home. It may just mean that they had the bad taste to go to Indiana University instead of Michigan State, or something like that. But we are going that direction, and we are also experimenting with using credit header data, which turns out to be more accurate than post office records, to contact voters, to ask them what the correct address is. And ultimately, what I see happening is something that's similar to what the motor vehicle administrators did, that for better and for worse means that if you get a speeding ticket on 29 between Charlottesville and Washington, D.C., it will show up on your California driver's license. But we have to do that in a way that doesn't give us the worst of the states that have registration policies that, in my view, disenfranchise people. So we want to be careful about how we do it, unless we have enough votes to pass a federal law, and right now we don't. But checking in with the voter, being able to track, this is the voter who got their driver's license, who came in to get their permit at age 15, and I think we ought to pre-register every young person who comes in to get a permit. We know who they are at that point. They bring in proof of who they are. And then we will know, this is this person, even if they don't live in the same place. So the new VoteCal system will accommodate that. It's been a painfully slow process, but it will go, it'll go back out to bid again in December. We had to fire the vendor. And, so it's been
I want to follow up on that good question about addresses and ask you, where do you think we're going in the future with voting? What's voting going to look like 10 or 20 years from now in California?
Good question. I actually think probably most people are going to be voting by mail, but I think we have most people voting by mail already. Yeah. You know, we're over 50%.
Well, the post office will be happy about that.
Well, but then that raises another question, which is, will we still have a post office that's dependable?
Uh-oh.
And the announcement this year that the post office was planning on closing many processing centers was very disturbing to election officials because of the likelihood that that would slow down, in particular, delivery of ballots and voter information guides, and especially voted ballots. And I think that it may mean that we go ultimately to a postmark plus system, which I know will deny many people their election night party. But I hate having ballots come in on Wednesday. I hate it. And that's not going to get better as the post office.
How's that going to work out? What are we going to do?
Well, Washington State does it now, and so does Oregon. It's a postmark plus system. The ballot, people are accustomed to that because we're all familiar with how the Internal Revenue Service works. And it is the postmark date that controls. Part of the struggle with voting is in California and many other states, it's not the postmark. So we're swimming upstream communicating to voters that you have to back up however many days you think it will take to get your ballot from wherever you're going to put it in the mail to your county registrar. And as we close processing centers, it may well be that a voter in Reading, for example, their ballot, if they drop it in the mailbox in Reading, will go to West Sacramento to be sorted and then back to Reading. And as an election official, that terrifies me. And I actually don't understand how it saves money either, but that's another question. And it's certainly not green. But so, you know, there are a lot of difficult questions.
What about the internet?
Well, you know, I think that the internet's actually become a more dangerous place, not a less dangerous place. You know, LinkedIn just lost a bunch of passwords. We're getting some very interesting information about something that the geeks among us have known about for a long time called the Stuxnet Virus, which is something that was targeted at centrifuges in Iran that literally did nothing but destroy the Iranian centrifuge. And led the Iranians to think that something was wrong with their software. They didn't realize that they were under attack. I just think that bringing down an election in the greatest democracy in the history of humankind is a big, fat, tempting target for a political enemy. And I just don't want to see that happen on my watch. Mm-hmm. And it may mean that we clearly could technologically program around it. Mm-hmm. We'd have to have a dedicated internet. Mm-hmm. Can't use the public internet and get around that. And then the question becomes, well, how much do you want to spend doing that? We use it twice every other year in federal elections, and would we be better off spending that money on voter education and other kinds of things rather than...
Speaking of your watch, you have 2 years left on your watch. You're in your second term, and you won the Profiles of Courage Award in 2008, which I'm sure you're very proud of. You've made a lot of changes. How do you want to be known as Secretary of State during these 8 years that you will be in this office? And what are you going to do next?
The answer to the second is you can ask me after November.
Okay.
Maybe before that, I don't know. I'm thinking about it.
but no answer today.
No answer today. But what I really want to do is, and what we have been doing, is change the election system so that we view it as we would any other kind of system, where we're constantly doing a process analysis, doing an error analysis, and improving the system in every election cycle, where we are constantly bettering the state of the rolls. If we can get people registered accurately, then it gets much easier to get them to vote. It's a big barrier if they're not registered properly. So not just the actual things that we've done, but the idea that we're going to look at this as a system and commit ourselves to taking it apart, analyzing our mistakes, and doing better in every single cycle. If we can have that embedded in the work of election officials and ultimately have things like election audit science take root so that we get an election system that is worthy of the great democracy that rides on it.
Fantastic. I want to thank you. There are a number of other questions, but we have some time for a reception. Hopefully you can
Absolutely.
Stay around and answer some questions. We have some food outside so we can continue the conversation. Want to thank you and very much for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Eric for enlightening us, and congratulations on the Washington Post editorial yesterday that mentioned your work and the work that we've been doing. Said that this is something the Secretary of State would like to hear too. That said we're off to a good start in California. It's not often that people in Washington have anything good to say about California, so
Your
we
point is well
consider that
taken.
a success, right? Ruben, I want to thank you for making those very kind comments, and my members of the Board of Directors who were here today, Tom Sutton, Gary Hart, and Donna Lucas, who were here, members of our staff who worked very hard to put on this event, and all of you for joining us. I would